Hi, good afternoon. I think maybe this is the first time I'm looking at a flower petal seating, and that means we have several negation signs on the seats, meaning that you're not supposed to take that seat because of the pandemic, and we're keeping social distance. Well, we are here amid the inconvenience of the pandemic, and it is also an opportunity for us to think and take a fresh look at the world. And this edition of Taipei Biennial is opening at such time. Well, I think it is actually a very good arrangement. I'd like to thank all the supporters, participants, scholars, and artists for making this happen. And we're also very happy that we can have this international event here in Taipei. Is Bruno with us? I think he is online, right? Well, the only pity is that Bruno LATOUR cannot be here with us because of pandemic, but he is going to be with us online. I am sure that he is also very concerned with this topic. Starting in 2017, he has worked with this museum, and actually that was before the 2018 Taipei Biennial Post-Nature. Well, I think that maybe it's like a predetermined relationship. He chose Taiwan and we chose him. He has a long-term relationship with STS and Academia Sinica, as well as the local scholars of geology. He is a philosopher and a scientist, and he has always maintained a good contact with the Taiwanese scholars because he viewed Taiwan as a very special example in terms of geopolitics and the geology. Because of that, he believed that we can do a demonstration. Taiwan can be a very good demonstration for his thought exhibition, and he values very much this opportunity to work together. Well, as a philosopher and scientist, he's always taking us forward. But his ideas are not just abstract ideas. In early days, he studied politics, and he also followed closely the relationship between scientific development and the society. So I feel that he is trying to, I wouldn't use the word to address, but I think he wants to propose potential solutions. I mean, when we are faced with challenges of climate change, we're like trapped there. I mean, the government can give us orders, but people still take to the street. So there's so many conflicts. How can we have a mode of communication to facilitate survival without entering into a war situation? Well, that's why we have this same concern for two editions of Taipei Biennial. We always believe that biennials is a very important carrier for social topics. So in 2017, we already determined that we're going to use two biennials at least in a row to address these social issues that are relevant to all of us. And Latour has given us very progressive methodologies in this new edition of Biennial. And I also like to introduce the independent curator, Martin Guinard, who has worked with Latour for many years. But Martin has curated exhibitions with Latour, and he has a background in arts. Art history. So, well, Latour wants to be a curator, but he starts with a theory background. So now they complement each other because they bring the best of the two worlds. But that's not enough. In terms of knowledge production, what curators plays the role of a fertilizer or a catalyst. So in addition to Martin, because thanks to his efforts, we find a lot of newly commissioned works by local artists in this biennial. And we also have commissioned works by international artists, like cooking section. These are results of this international curator going deep into the locality of Taiwan. And we also have another important driver behind this. That's Eva Lin. Eva Lin has organized several exhibitions, and these exhibitions are not merely exhibitions inside the galleries. He is known for curating at unconventional venues. And I always believe that Taipei Biennial is not limited to a few elites. We need to have a bigger impact. And the public programs curated by Eva Ling is going to take the ideas of Taipei Biennial to everyone, to the mass public. Well, our topic is for today is the new diplomatic encounters. We use this in one of our news release very early on, but then we decided to take it off, and we just kept the title "You and I Don't Live on the Same Planet." But this new diplomatic encounters is still a inner part of the biennial, and that's the negotiation skills that's embodied by the theater of negotiations. I am not a scholar or expert in this field. With my limited knowledge, I can imagine that we're not trying to find consensus, but we need to recognize the differences, divergent opinions, and try to seek a mode of coexistence. Therefore, I see this presentation and representation two ambitions or missions of exhibitions, and they seem to influence each other and drive each other. So in this editions of Taipei Biennial, you will find great works inside the gallery and outside the gallery. And for instance, we have activism in the theater of negotiations. We also have these arts coming down to earth, led by Stefan. So these programs will go beyond the boundaries of museums. I understand the process is never easy. Yesterday, I attended several events. For instance, I watched the Theater of Negotiation. Eva Ling invested so many energies there, and we had several young students there. That was good. And the talk was about renewable energy. And I heard the participants say this. One of them represent a corporation, right? So, and this participant said, "Well, today we spent 2 hours here. That was much more than the 2 months or 2 years of working in the industry, trying to find some compromise, and ultimately find himself in frustration." So this 2 hours for him is very rewarding, and he realized that we needed to have a suitable way or methodology to bring the two sides together. And secondly, the participants might not be very experienced, but they all have unlimited imagination about the future. So these are the words by one of the participants, and he found it rewarding. Well, I'm very happy about that. And secondly, we know there's a lot of interdisciplinary actions here, and we're trying to find out what role the museum can play when we connect different disciplines. For the fine arts world, I think that they need to relearn, and actually relearn is required for everyone. And so museum is trying to create a venue or the conditions, the context for this dialogue, so that the participants can understand the ideas, the theories, and the practice, the positions of the other fields. And in this process, listening and empathy are very important abilities to have. And let me share with you this anecdote. I met one of the legislators who participated in the theater of theater of negotiations. Actually, we received inquiries from 2 legislators, and one of them couldn't come, but one person did come, and he said that he or she said that many people were here, and that's very interesting. And I am very curious why the people in politics are not involved. I'm not sure if she meant political scholars or politicians, but that was really a question that was worthwhile thinking. So how come people from politics are not here? Well, next, I want to talk about how the events are different when they are inside the museum or outside of the museum. If, for instance, we have a group of farmers who take to the street to protect their land, then if we take that inside the museum, what does it mean? Is this an extension of a social event, or the museum can use its energy to transform such event or to enhance the thinking? Well, I think that museums actually can direct such energies to be a stronger evoke. We need to understand what the museum can do, and I believe that we can serve our duty of bringing people of different backgrounds together. Bruno is here. Would you like to say hi to Bruno? Our participants. Okay, so now I will turn the floor over to our moderator because we have a very intensive agenda, and I am very happy that you are here, and I hope you will find this rewarding, and you can take this back to your respective worlds. Thank you.
To thank you immensely for coming here. It's really our pleasure to greet you today for the opening symposium of this Taipei Biennial. Of course, I have to thank again the amazing team. I'll step a bit so you can see our poster behind. The amazing team from the museum for organizing this event, which was extremely complex to do in these times of pandemic. And again, the exhibition is stunning. And now the work with the public can start. Thanks to this symposium, we can start to dig into the problematics that we have to go through. So on top of the museum, of course, of Director Lin for invitation, and the artists. I also want to thank our advisors, and many of them are going to be speaking today, because the point of this biennial has not been that curators and philosophers from Europe would come to explain the situation, the current situation, to another part of the world. It has been to make a proposition, and from that proposition to allow a sort of test and see how relevant this proposition could be. And that proposition has been that the intuition that we want to follow is that the ecological mutation is not going to be one topic among others in the near future. It's not going to be one question among politics, society, and ecology. Ecology is going to frame the political discourse entirely. And that's what Bruno, who's with us right now, has called the new climatic regime, which is a term you might hear several times today. So it's quite surprising, because ecology was supposed to unify us, and yet it did not, for a set of reasons that we're going to explore through this symposium. And this is why we propose this title of saying that you and I don't live on the same planets, in the sense that we don't seem to share a common world anymore. So where do you go from there? And there's really, before Bruno presents his lecture, there's really two main objectives of today in the symposium. The first one is going to be to explore further what we mean by the fact that we don't live on the same planets, because of course it could be quite surprising to hear that, so that's something we're going to develop right now. And the second one is to explore how do we deal with this state of deep division. Yes, we are divided by the ecological question. The aim, it's not going to be to reunite too quickly, but let's hope that it's not going to be neither to stay in the state of, let's say, planetary wars that could happen at any time. And so that's why we are going to try to think through what could it mean to engage into diplomacy, and diplomacy being a technique which could help, let's say, potentially, this discussion between the different planets. So, again, I look very much forward to discuss with you. I thank you for your presence, and I think we can launch Bruno's lecture right now. Thank you.
Well, I am Bruno LATOUR. I'm talking to you from Paris. Unfortunately, because of a pandemic, I cannot be in person in Taipei. And I'm talking on behalf of my young colleague, Martin Guinard, who is the co-curator of the show. The situation, I don't have to remind you, is slightly difficult. There is a pandemic, but behind the pandemic, there is what I call the new climatic regime. That is a deep transformation in the way we imagine the connection between the different parts of the world. The pandemic has already simultaneously globalized, because it's a global event. That's what the word pandemic means. But it has also showed an extraordinary dispersion of reaction to the virus. And of course, Taiwan has drove a very original path in this multiple ways of reacting to the virus, and has been a model for the whole world. But the pandemic is not the object of the show. The object of the show is the change in the connection between nation states and cultures and people, because of the new situation imposed by the new climatic regime, that is what is usually called the ecological crisis. In a way, the pandemic is only one little aspect of that big changes. So it's what would be called the end or a redefinition of what was called globalization. This is why we call the show with Martin, You and I Don't Live on the Same Planet. The word planet is important because before, people would have said in the time of globalization, yes, of course, we have different view of the world, we have different religions, we have different political system, we have different cultures, we have different local habits, and so on and so forth. But we have only one nature. We have only one definition of the natural world, by which we meant essentially the planet Earth. The problem, as we see it for this show, is that this is no longer exactly true. There are people who live in a situation where they say there is no climate problem, we should start and go as we were doing before, and we have no need for a climate regime which will limit our development. So there are people who live in on Earth where there is a climate problem, and there are people who live or imagine that they live on a planet where there is no such thing. Basically, if you want to simplify, the government of the United States on one hand, the government of Europe, of China, India, and Taiwan, etc., don't have the same definition of a natural world. So the source of unity which was given by the natural world is gone. And the question we want to raise is, what is the successor of this lost unity? If we are no longer going sort of to be in the same direction, what is the alternative? And we say, well, the alternative is what we call new diplomatic encounter. So the show is based on the idea that we don't live on the same planet, that the solution is to imagine or trying out new ways of building makeshift form of what we call new universalities. I don't know if it's possible. We have no proof that it's actually feasible, but that's what a show is made for. A show is always a way to experiment on things which are not known yet. It's a sort of a laboratory. This is the way I've always done exhibitions. So the experiment is, can we find new diplomatic encounters for a situation where the notion of universal movement toward a globalized world is now completely shattered? Shattered by the pandemic, but shattered by the ecological situation. Now, why Taiwan? Why doing this in Taiwan? The first reason is that Martin and I have been invited by the Art Museum of Taipei, and we are very honored and pleased to have been able to answer this invitation. The other reason, which is that I've long collaboration with colleagues in Taiwan, working in a field which is not very well known, but very important for me, the field known as STS, Science and Technology Study, which has a very important influence in Taiwan, and to the beginning of which I was, with which I was involved in the past. So the reason why technology is so important is because there is no way we can find alternative to the globalized world, which is now, as I said, shattered, if we don't find other ways of looking at science and technology, and more generally, innovation. So that's the reason why I'm very pleased to meet my colleagues in Taiwan. The third, I don't need to insist on that, is that there is a vast geopolitical problem which is weighing on all the decisions and all of the local politics in Taiwan, which is the international situation everyone knows. But the fourth one, for me, is that, and that's not very well known, is that Taiwan is also very important geologically in terms of phenomena which are accumulated on the island because of its unique situation, plate tectonic, typhoons, rains, and of course the whole effect of the economic development on a small island. So in many ways, you have the Earth, and then you have Taiwan. And Taiwan is, in a way, a sort of local version of the Earth, with all the geopolitical prime, all the geological primes, all the prime of development concentrated on one case. So we wanted to pursue, if you want, this Russian doll model and say, okay, if Taiwan is a model of the Earth, can we, in the show itself, that is in the Taipei Art Museum, make a model of that situation? And that's what we have been trying to do in the exhibition. You and I don't live in the same on the same planet. That is a scale model of all the primes accumulated on the island of Taipei, linking the geopolitics, the classical question of nation state invading or not invading one another, with the other much more difficult to understand and much more important connection, this time with the geological version, that is climate, typhoons, control of resources, and development in general, inside the limited Earth that we know now we inhabit. So that's the second question I wanted to deal with you, that is, why are we in Taiwan? And why do you ask French people to be in Taiwan? The next one is, why art? Because people could ask the question, I mean, this is a very maybe interesting problem, that it is a problem for politicians, it's a problem for scientists. Why do you think that you should bring art in to the question? And more especially, why would you bring this question inside an art institution? But I have to explain. My way of doing curator, I'm not a curator, but I've done many exhibitions, is that the medium of exhibition is interesting as what I call, with Peter Weibel, the director of ZKM in Karlsruhe, thought exhibition of thinking. It doesn't mean it's complicated. It just means that it's a scale model for an experimental situation that there is no other way to produce. That is, in a show, you can build a space which is the scale model of something which you cannot possibly build at the real scale. This is what scientists do when they build a scale model, or that's what they do when they do what they call thought experiment. That is, imagine an experiment which in their head, because there is no way to do it. So I've always done thought exhibition, trying to solve questions which you cannot do otherwise. And there is in Karlsruhe actually a show called Critical Zone, which is related to this exhibition in Taipei, at least in my mind. The reason of those connection inside an art space is that you can mix what I would call three different ways of representing a problem. What I call the three aesthetics. The first one is, of course, political question. I mean, we are used to consider that politicians are activists, militant workers, citizens, represent the voices of those who are not heard, and that's what would be called the political aesthetics. It's less well known that there is a second aesthetics, which is the one represented by scientists. After all, what scientists do? Well, they represent, that is, they make the voices heard of many phenomena which are inaudible, impossible to hear without that. So scientific instruments are the way to make phenomena which are not known and audible. Of course, in the case of a climate transformation of the Earth, everything we know about it, almost everything we know about it, comes from the scientist instrumentation. And it's very interesting that in Taipei, there are many different places where the science of geology and the science of a special discipline of earth science, which is called critical zone, is actually implemented, and we want to use that in the show. If you consider these two aesthetics, the political and the scientist, then the third one, the one which is more traditionally called aesthetics, which is implemented and invented by artists, then become much more understandable, because what we don't have to understand right now in the situation of a new climatic regime, the news brought to us by the scientists and the reactions imposed on us by politicians, is because we don't have the right affective, mental, moral, and imaginary equipment. Nobody knows what it means to shift from the state of globalization in which we were moving before to this other state, which is the state of ecological mutation. We have been in the past in such a situation when, during what is called the scientific revolution, there has been a change in the way the Earth was considered and the place of this Earth in the general cosmos. We had this cosmological revolution in the 17th century, when the great scientists of Galileo and from Galileo to Newton made us move, so to speak. And when I say us, it means really every country on Earth were moved to live inside the modernizing space which had been devised by this first scientific revolution. Well, it turns out that what is happening now for us is about the same size. That is a new transformation, a new move or displacement, if you want, of the cosmology which was being invented in the 17th century, which has, so to speak, to be not exactly disinvented, but requalified today because of the ecological crisis. The cosmology that was invented in the 17th century was not supposed to be introducing us into a limited space where we now have to live, almost 9 billion of us, with entangled and complicated relations like the one we have, the virus, the pandemic, being one example of those entanglements. We were supposed to be indefinitely emancipated, so to speak, and modernized, all of us, without any sort of limit. And suddenly we realize we have to live together, but inside a much more entangled and much more difficult place to live in. It's a shift in cosmology. So this is why we need the art. And we need to think and experiment thinking about this question in art institution, precisely because we don't possess the affective equipment, the feelings and the forms necessary to handle that new cosmology. And the works which we have been assembling for the show with Martin Guinard all try to probe those connections between art, politics, and science, which is unusual, I agree, in an art institution. But this was our line. And this is why we are very grateful for the staff and the management of the Taipei Art Museum to have allowed us to do this experiment. So the idea is that to test alternative ways of handling this new cosmology, which doesn't have the same quality and not the same universality as the one invented before in the 17th century. Basically, what's the alternative to globalization and modernization? It's a subject I've worked on for many years, but here it's another instantiation of the same problem, amplified, of course, by the pandemic and the ecological situation. Now, you see why we do this, the general political situation, which is sort of end of globalization. You see why we do this in Taipei. You see and you understand why we need the art and the link between art, politics, and science in an artistic institution. And now we need to understand how we are going to do this. This is what we call new diplomatic encounters. Before, there was a sense of diplomacy which was, if you want, the traditional sense. That is, you have one state, another state, they overlap, and either they fight or they sort of find sort of compromise, and they ask diplomats to work out the limits of those negotiations. Diplomacy between being the first, probably the most ancient art. Now we want to do it, but it's more complicated because we have this division of planet. That is, those who want to go on with globalization, those who say, no, globalization is finished, we want to go out of the earth entirely and let the earth sort of go to hell, if you want. And we will go to Mars, or we will multiply the technology so much that we will benefit whatever happens to you, the people left behind. That's the second planet exit. And then there is the other planet, the planet precisely of people who say, if there is no globalization, and if there is no way for us to go to the planet exit because it's only for the very, very rich people, what do? Well, we limit ourselves inside the nationalistic boundaries, which seems to us the only safe way to resist this end of globalization. So we have at least 3 different planets with completely different interests, completely different ways of handling geopolitics, if you want. So we are interested, of course, in the divide between these 3 different planets, and a 4th one, which is the one in which we would like to live in, that is the one which would accept the limit of the what the geology and the ecology is, that is the planet which we call, there is no name for that, so we had to invent the terms. I call it terrestrial. It's not exactly planet Earth as it was before, the planet of a 17th century scientific revolution. It's something else. And that's what it is, which we try to explore in this show. The terrestrial doesn't have the same feeling. It doesn't have the same space. It's not in the same time. It doesn't require the same thing from people. It is an entirely different cosmological adventure. That's what we try to illustrate, or more exactly, trying to prepare, so to speak. The only way to do this is by bringing people, visitors, academics, journalists, activists, curators, into controversies, mapping controversies about the multiplicity of those planets in detail, that is, inside specific controversial topics which are now being important in Taiwan. So this is why the show is not only people visiting the space and learning about all those beautiful artwork and learning about the multiplicity of those planets, it's also trying to find a way to situate themselves inside this controversial space. That space is controversial is what is in question in this exhibition. So there's no way we can escape or evade the moment when we say, okay, here I am, which planet do I prefer? The planet globalization, the planet exit, the planet we call identity, the planet we call terrestrial. And if I choose one of the others, how am I going to find those who are, so to speak, my friends and who are my enemies, which after all is a very, very traditional definition of politics. So, of course, it's not a political show in the classical sense of arguing for one line against another, but it's political in this very new understanding of the word, that we are in a we are in a shift of cosmology. So it's not just the same cosmology and different politics, it's a different cosmology. We are back to a situation which had been lived through by people 4 centuries ago, when they were precisely discovered the first planet, that is planet Earth. Well, now we're discovering another one. It's not exactly the same. That's why I call it critical zone, because it's not the whole planet in terms of globe. It's a very thin layer of Earth which has been transformed by life forms. It's also called Gaia in another scientific discipline. And on this little tiny small zone, we have to imagine that this is where we live. And we have to find ways of mapping through controversies where we are and what we can do in this new land. It's basically a shift of land. It's as if the whole 9 billion people were shifted to another land. So it's very exciting. It's an exciting moment. It's immensely depressing, because all of the attitude and reflex and affect that we had before had to be reworked. And we need a way to do this experimentally. And that's what we are going to do through this show with Martin Guinard and the extraordinary staff and directorship of the Art Museum in Taipei. I hope I've illustrated the general topic, and that we will be many, not me unfortunately, visiting the show and learning about it. And I am very grateful to the Taiwanese for allowing us to do this. Thank you.
All right. So thank you to Bruno, who's going to join us in a few seconds for this really interesting lecture. And now comes the question, the time when you're welcome to ask your questions. And I invite my co-curator, Evelyn, to join me for this session. And we are now with Bruno right here, so really feel free to ask. We're seeing.
因为其实蛮难得可以跟 Bruno 老师做对话，所以有任何问题也都不要太客气，这样子。
It's quite a rare opportunity to ask questions to Bruno LATOUR, so please feel free to ask your questions.
很简单的问题。
I have one simple question. Curation is a process. Now we're at the point of opening. However, it has been a long time where the three of you, including Bruno, has been participating in the whole process. While previously you might have had some imagination, and Bruno, you are in a distant land, something might have happened and it's different from your expectations. It made you feel surprised. And what is your thought about these incidents? What's your feelings happening in here, about things happening here?
Director Lin, I'm very happy to be able to say hello to you directly. The first thing, of course, which is surprising, is the fact that we actually were able to do the show in spite of the international situation and the pandemic. I did not anticipate this interconnection between the pandemic and the new climatic regime. So in that sense, everything is simultaneously much better than I expected, largely thanks to your museum and staff, and the international situation that we wanted to model, so to speak, is infinitely worse. So in those two dimensions, I think the opening of a show, and especially the work done by Eva Lin, is validated. We didn't think the situation would be so bad, but we succeeded in trying to explore the diplomatic encounters.
I could add to this thing is that what I could add to this comment is that, of course, you know, an exhibition starts with a brainstorm, with a concept, and very often when people come to see an exhibition made by a philosopher like Bruno, they think that the artists are going to be mobilized in order to prove a point or to illustrate it. Whereas actually, in the way that we've worked, we do start with questions, and Bruno is so impressive at putting his finger on the pulse, seeing where there is an issue. But so are the artists. The artists explore that kind of complex situation in another way. And what's really beautiful, and that's a lesson that Bruno taught me, is that I was trained in art history thinking that theory should always back up the artworks, and not the artworks should not back up the theory. But really, one of the things that I've learned through working with Bruno is that once you've explored what the artwork does, the initial concept is changing. And that I can give very concrete examples of that. When I invited Arsai Takivalet to work in this show, his work was in one section. He imagines beautiful plants that he could see when he was making, let's say, trips in his neighborhood. He was observing very carefully some plants, and today he almost cannot find them anymore. So he makes very specific drawings of those plants which are rare, becoming more rare. And he also imagines what kind of plants might come in the future, by growing through the plastic bits of garbage that are everywhere, etc. They're absolutely wonderful illustrations and artworks. But while we were curating the show, we thought that they had to be one place, and we realized that actually they had to be disseminated through the terrestrial planets, because plants grow everywhere, as we were discussing with Chief Curator Charlie Yu. Those kind of details, really, they happen while you're setting up. You cannot have them in a preconceived manner. And so in a way, it's a beautiful medium exhibition because it allows you to do this kind of back and forth between the ideas that you have, what the artists allow you to see, the constraints that you have, because of course, there's more constraints when you're working with a staff of 30 people, that it has material cost of building walls, etc., than when you're writing a text. But it's really a medium which is really beautiful because its constraints really have the capacity to create new kind of connection that you would not expect at first hand.
I would like to share two things. One is that my talk with Bruno is about my talk with Bruno. Something I learned a lot is our agency in the artistic environment. We're not saying what art can do for the society. For example, when we're talking about Anthropocene, like Professor Ling was talking about, the definition of Anthropocene is different now. The point is how it has changed our perception about it and how it has changed people's thinking about the environment. So I think the idea of Anthropocene has made people more reflective. And I think during this exhibition, during the curation, we're made more active to respond to issues in the society. And another thing is about this topic of you and I don't live on the same planet. It's not just that we don't have the same opinions. It's also about the materiality of Earth. There's a lot of differences or divisions in it. Now I have a different idea about Latour. Before I knew him, I thought of him as a philosopher. And he wrote difficult books. It was really hard to read those books. But then I realized that he liked hot pots. He likes to eat hot pots. And whatever I say, he shows a lot of interest. I guess that is why even now, Bruno has a lot of curiosity. He's curious about so many things. And I think curiosity is the best way to respond to changes in the world. Don't be shy if you have any questions to Bruno. I think he's be really interested.
我想
I have questions for Bruno LATOUR about the proposal. So previously, we had only one definition about the Earth, and we started from globalization. But then you started to experiment, you started to explore. During this process, should we be more cautious about not falling into the trap of another single definition or single process? Or is that one single definition or process necessary? It's just there's going to be a different planet. So that is my question.
Question, because that's why we choose the title of this exhibition to open up exactly the same question as the one you asked. That is, how many planets are we actually able to envision simultaneously? So the exhibition is your question. Globalization was organized around the idea of a horizon toward one planet, meaning really Americanization, basically. And suddenly, we have to decide. And the show has been devised as a fiction, because of course, you and I don't live on the same planet, is a fiction, but as an experiment to answer your question. That is, it's now the choice of visitors to align themselves more with this one or this other one through the own power of the artistic work which have been assembled. For instance, it's perfectly possible that people find the life in the bunker of the planet escape very good and very nice. So the interesting thing of the exhibition is not to give one answer to your question. It just, the only thing we add is the possibility of the terrestrial. And the terrestrial has another definition of the land itself, of the materiality, as Eva Lina said. It's exactly that. So the show is exactly about that. No decision is made.
Of course, Bruno, I would add, not only it's not about recreating a homogeneity, but it's also about deciding where you want to stand, on which planet do you want to stand, which kind of planet you want to inhabit, since this is the whole purpose of the show. And that's something which, again, like when we do this exhibition, when I was saying earlier, we're trying to test something, we come with a proposition and we're trying to test. Okay, we think we live on different planets. Where do you think you have to stand? Of course, you know, we all have contradictions to resolve. Like, as a curator, I'm a wannabe terrestrial who lives on planet globalization. That's the kind of tensions that I have to resolve. What are your tensions? That's the kind of questions which we need to raise. And that's the kind of, you know, like that's the kind of experiences that we hope you will feel when you like experience the show, among the many other things that you can feel, because artworks are complex and never talk only about one thing. But it's really, I think indeed you pinned the very, you know, core of the question we're trying to tackle here. Quangxi.
Hello, Bruno, Martin, and Eva. I have one question about this show. I read about your articles about the planets, and they were seven planets in the beginning, but now they became 5, and one of them disappeared, and you added one, the planet with alternative gravity. So the addition, subtraction of these planets, does that carry some significance? Could you share this with us?
Tu veux que je réponde à ça?
No, it carries my own uncertainties. So, as I said, it's a word of fiction. People, more serious people like Deepesh Chakrabarti or Christophe Bonneuil talk about planetary regime, and they are trying to count the number of them as good historians. But my own use of the word planet is a fictional concept that depends on where we are and how can you implement the choice by people and how they align themselves. So you're right that we change our number, and here we decided to have those planets according to the space, because the show is also about a specific space, a beautiful one here, and of course the works of art, which allow people to align themselves for or against some of the planet. We decided that we needed to limit the number. But you are right that the counting is still a work in progress. It's not like counting pigs or chickens, because precisely planet is a fiction. It's a way to make people think about the diversity of the Earth.
I could jump on that on saying that the diversity, but yet limiting the most, what we saw as some of the most powerful representations and forces, or cosmologies if you want, that are acting up today. Then, as you know, as I was saying earlier, you know, making an exhibition, it's not as flexible as writing. And when we were brainstorming with Bruno 2 years ago on the theme of the biennial, I had in mind the work of the artist Jonas Dahl, who depicts the propaganda of the ultra-right in America, which really looked like it was depicting the planet's security. And I had in mind the work of Femke Hergraven, who is so interested in the bunkers that billionaires would be working on, and she had a whole set of works about that. So, you know, like Bruno has a million ideas, and, you know, I was trying to see what could translate in the show. And during the course of the discussion, Bruno was saying, oh, okay, we don't live on the same planet. And I said, okay, let's make the exhibition about that. But we, of course, every time you say we don't do something, you always have somebody who stands up and say, who is the we? So we decided to switch to you and I. But so to say very concretely, with the artists that we could find that had to be good artists, you know, we knew that we had, we, Bruno, I, Eva, knew that we had a really good set of artists for planet security and escape, which are really hard to represent normally. Planet globalization, sorry. I should speak louder. Okay, I'll speak louder, sorry. Planet globalization is really easy to depict in the art world. Planet terrestrial, in a way, you had many beautiful examples of terrestrial artists in the last edition as well. Post-nature was very much about how you want to develop this kind of terrestrial approach. So yeah, indeed, the exhibition as a medium is less versatile in the sense that once you have an idea, you also need to find the artist who is good, willing to work on it, can deliver something about it. And so this is like the result of a pragmatic concern, but I don't think we sacrificed a narration, because again, this is an open-ended show. You know, like we say it from the very beginning, the first text is how many planets there are. It's still up to you to figure out. What is sure is that there's maybe not, you know, if we say that there's 1 million planets, we might start to lose some intensity of this kind of configuration, which is already much richer than a very simple dialectic of just 2 attractors. You know, having 4 or 5 attractors is already more interesting than having 2. There's questions there.
Hello. We're also opening the floor to the audiences online. So there's a question here, which is, which planets do the 3 curators want to live on? Thank you.
Eva, yeah? Which planet do you want to live?
The planet of planet.
But as I was saying, personally, I'm a global. I live on planet globalization, and I really try to look for a solution to go toward planet terrestrialization, and it's difficult.
Well, it's clear that for me there is a bias towards the terrestrial, because that's where the tension is built. I mean, actually, terrestrial is the only way to have a multiplicity of planets. An interesting feature is that the others have a globalizing view, a unitarian view, let's say. So there is something in the terrestrial which is specific, which, or rather, which underline again the specificity and the non-scalability of planet Earth. So this is the one, of course, for me, which is the most interesting because of its specific metric. It doesn't have to scale up. It's highly specific. Critical zones, actually, the scientists who study it are constantly talking about heterogeneity. And that's why I prefer the terrestrial. But like Martin, I live on the planet globalization. And you know, I would dream to take a plane and come to here to see the show by myself. So we are all divided.
Okay, so we have one last question. So is there a hand raising here? I think this one was.
I have a question related to war, and I want to ask the curators. You mentioned that diplomacy has a different definition in the past and today. What about war? Do you think that it also has a different definition now? So why did you use the word encounter instead of war? And in Bruno's book, you propose this word protocare, Tony War. So what's that kind of word? So why did you choose to encounter instead of a war?
Bruno, pourquoi est-ce qu'on a utilisé rencontre au lieu de guerre?
Yeah.
I think I will start by saying that, well,
it's of course that. Sorry, Martin. Sorry.
Non, vas-y, Bruno, vas-y, on t'écoute.
It's because we are at war. we don't need to add wars on wars. We have to imagine, in a state of war, it's clear that Mr. Trump doesn't have the same definition of the earth, and let's say a critical zone scientist or activist, like the groups in Europe, which is called Generation Extinction. So we are at war. We don't need to add more to it. We have to imagine the next step. That's why we do shows. That's what, as Director Lin said yesterday and this morning, this is why shows have to be done into artistic institution. You cannot do that at the United Nations, because Taiwan again has been shunned out of it. You cannot do it in universities because it's too fictional. So the only way you can anticipate the next move, that is, once war is declared and acted out, you need to imagine diplomacy. So this is why we insisted on encounters and not on the term war. Sorry, Martin.
No, absolutely not. But on top of that, I mean, diplomacy is precisely the process which happens before war or after war. So again, that's because we don't want to prolongate those wars, and we don't want to get into the ones which are to come, which are going to be tougher and more intense. So this is really like the key of our proposition, actually.
我补充一下，就是可能用战争，大家会觉得好像是。
If we use the word, if we use war, you might find it very dramatic. But actually, we are in a chaotic state. So how do we find a temporary order before we enter into another chaos? And we need to find temporary ways, one after another, to face future challenges.
对。
Actually, my question is related to the previous gentleman's. So thank you very much, Professor Bruno LATOUR. I count myself very fortunate to be able to attend this meeting, because today, all of a sudden, I call my friend, and then my friend told me that we have a wonderful speech which will be given by Professor LATOUR. So personally, I like the title a lot, New Diplomatic Encounters, because for me, encounter means adventure. Encounters means something that is not preconceived. Encounter means something that can be generated anew or can be thought anew. So your ideas, for me, are very interesting, because in the because of the pandemic, because of the COVID-19, we have a lot of social, political, and international disruptions. And after the, in the wake of the pandemic, perhaps we have to think about the so-called new diplomatic encounters. But in the past, we have, the ecological order, and then we have the ecological disorder, and then we have the pandemic disruption. So for me, the title is well chosen. And of course, a while ago you said that you want to use encounter to replace the word war, because the encounter between subject and object, the encounter between human and non-human, it is not dialectical. Namely, we don't want to contain, or we don't want to tame, or we don't want to domesticate. We don't want to subjugate the other. So, I mean, your ideas are very interesting because, you know, in your talk, you also mentioned you want to generate a new universality. So my question is, does your concept of universality related to, you know, Deleuze and Guattari's idea of transversality or something like that? Because your concept for me are multi-model. You don't specify any single solution, because for, you know, there is no single story in international arena. Thank you.
Well, this is a very important question, because you added the forbidden word universality. In a way, the show and the encounters organized by Eva, Lynn, and Martin is trying to slow down, one, the notion of universality. This is why we have 5 planets, or 7 or 8. 2, the abandon of the notion of universality. Because as the first question rightly asked, we still need some plane to compare this diversity of planets. And of course, the fiction is, we do that inside the museum. But still, there is a frame, the museum, inside which the multiplicity of planets can be shown. So in a way, we do cherish the notion of universality. And I'm sure Professor Yu-Kui will speak about it. But it's not a universality which has to be denying the fact that we are at war. So this is why I call it wicked universality. It's still a goal, but it should not be achieved too quickly, so to speak.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you for this statement, which was a beautiful way of concluding this first session. It was actually a very good summary. So again, thank you. We're going to take on a short break, and we'll come back very soon in now 10 minutes to listen to Professor Yu-Kui from Hong Kong, who's going to talk to us about the notion of the planetary. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.